Anyway, thank you for coming out. I'd also like to thank the library, and I'd like to thank Jess Ross, who is setting up this presentation. And I'm really delighted that you all came out here because this is a great story. It's a great story that everybody knew about, has known about, who was around here during the time of the 1970s, but it was never written down. And so in 2014, which was the 40th anniversary of the town vote, when the Durham Historical Association had a meeting to celebrate the 40th anniversary, I was really extremely impressed. I'd been around in that period, but I was extremely impressed that all these people were still interested and still working hard. And so I thought, well, this would be a really good project to undertake. So the title of the book, of course, is Small Town Big Oil, because it refers to small town against a big oil project. Before starting it, I would like to read from an older voice that was mentioned on about a 5-minute YouTube video, which talked about the Battle of Durham Point. And in that over voice, it said, it reminded us all that New Hampshire is rich in natural beauty. Its 18 miles of beaches and rugged coastline are fed by a web of rivers and estuaries that fuel the economy for many New Hampshire communities. This is a story about legacy and about how the actions of ordinary people can impact the lives of many for generations to come. It is also a story about recognition of the often underappreciated role that women play in society. And it is a story about today, balancing the reality of our energy needs and understanding our responsibility to our community and to our descendants. But to understand this responsibility, we must first take a step back into the past. What did the past look like in 1973? In the summer or fall of 1973, the United States was experiencing the worst recession since the Great Depression of the 1930s. Economic growth was sluggish, stagnant, yet there was high inflation, leading to the term stagflation. There was a fuel shortage with long gas lines, high prices for food and fuel. That was the condition in which many communities in the Durham community found itself in 1973. The long gas lines, one could see, were extended, sometimes 20, 30, 40 cars. At one point, the gas stations went into allocating fuel on the basis of what the number was on your plate. If the last number on your license plate was even, you would get Wednesday, Friday. If it was odd, you would get Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, and sometimes on Sunday they wouldn't be able to sell gas at all. Into this horrible economic situation, there appeared a man who was willing to essentially bring an oil refinery to the state, which nobody knew at first that's what he wanted to do. But this is the Aristotle Onassis that most people remember. A man who had been married, who had just in 1968 married Jackie Kennedy, the widow of the president. And yet there was another aspect to him. While there he looks very meek and mild and pleasant, there was the real Aristotle Onassis, a man who was ruthless and would get what it is he wanted. In addition to Aristotle Onassis, who appeared on the scene, there was also William Lowe, the slimy publisher of the Manchester Union Leader, the big bully before who kind of presaged our current situation, a man whose main way of arguing was to go after people. He would go after politicians, which you can understand, but of course he had to call them names which at that time was considered just inexcusable, and today done all the time. He would also go after politicians' families, their wives, and he would go after the children. And in fact, in one case, he went after the child of one politician so much that she had a nervous breakdown, and that didn't stop him. And then the third antagonist in this was Governor Melvin Thompson. He was a Southerner from Georgia. He had been in the state, though, for well over a decade. He came to office in 1972. First was elected governor with the support of the Union leader. Without the support of the Union leader, he would have been just another local man in the state, but he was very arch conservative, and of course, ultimately, we know he was a kind of a nutcase. You know, he was the guy who wanted to arm our National Guard with nuclear weapons. And in his first year in office, he decided to go after his opponents, seeing if they had any criminal records, and went down to Massachusetts to the Federal Registry to see if they had any criminal records of his opponents. So those are the three antagonists in this story. What Aristotle Onassis proposed to do was build an oil refinery on Durham Point, which at that time would have been the largest grassroots refinery in the world. 400,000 barrels of oil per day. It's really incredible to think about that. Only a few years earlier in California, there had been a new oil refinery, 73,000 barrels of oil a day. This was 6 times as large. It would have worth $600 million to build, $3.2 billion today. And along came with that proposal were 3 promises that were designed to convince the public as well as to convince the legislature that an oil refinery was needed, and that is there would be many, many, many new jobs. 15,000 was one figure bandied about. There would be more gas and home heating oil. That meant that even though there were shortages in another part of the country, supposedly in Durham, we would get the benefit of the oil refinery and be allowed to have more home heating oil and more gas. And finally, it was supposed to be such a large tax break because the oil refinery could be taxed, and it would essentially reduce the tax rates of people in the town by 2/3 or more. Those were the promises. This is the schematic of the oil refinery. I've got a little pointer here. Okay. This is Lunging Island out here with the Isles of Shoals. And Lunging Island was going to be the docking place for the large oil tankers. Underwater would be an oil pipe that would take it to Rye, and then over land it would go until it had to go under Great Bay and then into Durham. And this whole, the black enclosed area is the town of Durham. The red area are the options, the acres that the oil refinery supporters had been able to buy. And that wasn't even all that they eventually were able to buy. Eventually they got options on some 3,000 acres in Durham. And that's where the oil refinery was going to be. If you take a look at here, this picture, this was taken by me because I risked my life to go up into a little red helicopter that you can go on if you go out to Portsmouth. These very narrow helicopters. Had the door open on the left side, and one time I went like this to kind of scratch my head. My hand went whipping around. And I'm sitting there. I have been on military choppers. I was in Vietnam. And I felt comfortable in those, in a combat zone. In this one, it was shaking and it was very narrow. And I tell you, Anyway, all for the sake of art, right? All for the sake of the story. So this is the back part of UNH, and there's you go through town. This is Kingsbury Hall, and you come in here, and there's the Oyster River. So the oil refinery was supposed to be in this area right in here. And you can see what the picture looks like today, and imagine what it would have looked like had the oil refinery been there. As a matter of fact, you can't even imagine it because, as Dudley has mentioned so many times, it wasn't just the oil refinery, it was all of the other industries that would go along with it that would have completely transformed this area of the country. The Onassis people came up with a model of an oil refinery, and this model is shown here. This was what was looked at in Concord. It was first shown in Concord, and it was a very pretty little model that made it look as though there is the model itself, there's the rest of the area, and it all looks so serene and so pretty. This is what the model looked like up close. This is what the oil refinery, these are all tanks, and this is the oil refinery itself, which looks like a really small segment of the overall operation. But if you take a look at what typical oil refineries look like, and this one was supposed to be the biggest in the world, this is what they look like further down. So you can imagine what that whole area would have looked like with that oil refinery there and all of those storage tanks. They said, literally, Constantine Gratzel said, and he was Aristotle Onassis' chief assistant, that when lit up, this would look like a Christmas tree. So this is what they thought would look like a Christmas tree. Dudley has in her slideshow what an actual Christmas tree looks like. So it's hard to, resolve the differences in the values between those who thought that this looked like a Christmas tree and those who think that this does. One other idea about how large this was is shown by this comparison. So first of all I want you to do is just take a look at this honeymoon cottage. This was on Lunging Island. And it is on Lunging Island. It's just a little, it's there. Now, when you take a look at it from this perspective, you can see that it's right there. So you get an idea how long Lunging Island is and where that honeymoon cottage is. And now next to it, we get an idea of how large a tanker would be when it docked there. It's just incredible. You can't believe. But that filled with oil, these were their super large tankers. And that's how large it would be. But of course, they were going to be refining 400,000 barrels of oil per day. You're going to have a lot of those tankers, a lot of oil go through those pipes. Well, to the rescue, the protagonists in this story include Nancy Sandberg, who eventually became the head of an organization, and Nancy will talk to you about that. Dudley, who was a first-term representative from Durham, the first Democratic woman ever elected from Durham, the only woman at that time who was elected from Durham, with the rest of the other three legislators all being males, and the legislature itself being dominated by males. And then Phyllis Bennett. Phyllis Bennett was the publisher of a small newspaper that began in August of 1973 called Public Occurrences. Public Occurrences was named after the first Public Occurrences, which was in 1680, that had one edition, which the governor didn't like and therefore jailed the publisher. The second edition was in August of 1973 when Steve Bennett and Phyllis Bennett decided that they would found their own local newspaper. They had money to invest, and they decided their dream was to invest it in a newspaper that would serve local communities. So those are the three heroes, basically, the three people who played such crucial roles in the effort to stop the Onassis oil refinery. So I'm going to go back to Nancy and let Nancy give you her story of how she came to be the head of SOS, what it entailed, and so on. If we could turn the lights back on.
I changed my mind.
Okay, all right.
I think this will be better,
Your,
if that's okay with you.
okay, no, that's fine.
Such a great crowd tonight. I'm delighted. I'm sitting here and listening to David going over this, listening to David go over the history of almost 50 years ago, and trying to think, how can I convey how I felt then? I was 27 years old, my husband now sitting in the front row, a school teacher at Exeter High School. Our daughter Betsy was about 4. She was in nursery school. We were on the family farm and planting apple trees and having a huge vegetable garden and selling fruits and vegetables out of our barn to help pay Durham taxes. And you have to realize that we were living this really quite bucolic existence on this family farm. And into that life, as some of you have read the book, great big black Oldsmobile or Buick drove up the driveway, and I'm in the front garden with herbs and stuff, and all sweaty. It's August, it's about 89 degrees, and I'm thinking, oh my God, who is this? Gets out of the car, dark blue kind of pinstripe suit. And I thought, these aren't the usual visitors here. And he was very polite, but said, oh, you have so much land. I just need a little bit of land. And I said, oh, I'm so sorry, but this is our farm, and we're not in a position to sell it, or don't want to sell it either. Well, he pressed a little bit more, but then he realized that I wasn't interested. Mal came home that late afternoon, and I told him what happened. I got talking to neighbors 3 or 4 days later. They'd been approached by same dark car, person in a suit, and then there was a rumor of someone else in a different kind of car, and it was very suspicious. We just had a sense that people were out on Durham Point looking to acquire land, and they had several different stories. But we were right away quite suspicious of them. I can't tell you exactly why. It just seemed like they had more up their sleeves than we bargained for. I had been studying our town. We had been in Durham about 3 years. I had joined the League of Women Voters to learn more about town government, and the women I met there were just terrific, and I was learning about the planning board process and zoning. Durham was one of the first towns in New Hampshire to do zoning, and we knew we already had the university in our town. That was our big industry, taking up almost a quarter of our land area in Durham. And so it was really important how we were envisioning the town's future. And I'd been on, you know, in little discussion groups with other young women my age who had young kids in nursery school or elementary or high school or whatever. And Durham had a master plan. It had planned out how it wanted its future to be. So not knowing exactly what these land dealings were on Durham Point, we definitely were aware that it was an area that had creeks and rivers that flowed into the Great Bay, and that it was a watershed that needed to be protected. And so there had been plans to at least try and make an effort to preserve those watersheds. So we decided that what we needed to do was have a meeting and see if we couldn't get to the bottom of this issue. Find out who was behind this, what was going on. It must be some big outfit, some big corporation that wanted to build a headquarters or a manufacturing plant or something like that. We just couldn't even imagine what it might be. So we asked our town moderator, Francis Robinson, if he would meet with a group of about 25 of us up in the Diamond Library at UNH. And we had a meeting there one night in, I think it was early September or late August, I can't remember exactly. But everybody shared their stories of being approached by various men in dark cars asking for with various stories of why they wanted to acquire land. And so before we knew what we were opposing, we decided we had to be organized. So we formed Save Our Shores, but we didn't, we spent over an hour trying to think of a good name for it, and when it got to be 11 o'clock, it didn't matter what the name was. So we decided, okay, that's okay. There had been an organization of Rhode Island called Save the Bay, and so we just kind of glommed onto that. But at any rate, and Elaine Schubert, a friend of mine, piped up and said, "Oh, I think Nancy Sandberg would make a great head of our organization." Everybody was so anxious to get home. Everybody said, yeah. So when I got home that night, Mel was sound asleep. I woke him. I said, "You'll never guess what. I've got myself the head of something like the Seacoast Anti-Pollution League, that opposing the nuclear power plant." And he just rolled over and said, "Don't worry, Nancy, you'll be fine." So the next 9 months were the most intense 9 months of our lives. It was just right out the door, networking to try and get to the bottom of this. This was the age when we only had telephones and walking back and forth or driving back and forth, no internet, no easy way to communicate. But it was about a month later, or more, maybe a little bit more, David can correct me. After all these many years, you lose track of the time frame. But there was this little headline on Public Occurrences, "Oil refinery for Durham Point." The paper had sleuthed out what was going on, that there was this group of Greek associates of Onassis, business partners in New York, who were aware that Governor Thompson wanted to build a refinery in New Hampshire. They put two and two together. It was the energy crisis. They thought this was going to be great. But what was so important was that right out of the box, we were opposed to it because we used our zoning ordinance to defend ourselves. We said, well, the people of Durham have worked hard to plan ahead for their future, and their future only included light industry in certain very specific areas. And so we were very hopeful that we could, ward them off right away. But unfortunately, our selectmen had been advised by their legal advisors that they should take a neutral role and let the community decide at some date in the future. That if they took a stand and defended their zoning ordinance, that it might go against them in a court of law. Well, this just made all of us out on Durham Point very mad, really frankly, because it didn't feel right to us that we couldn't stand up for what we had worked so hard to plan for the future of our town. So we developed a position statement that we were opposed to a refinery, that refineries should be sited where they could be away from water bodies, and that they should be welcomed by the town that wanted it. We had to very quickly, recognizing that we wouldn't have the leadership in the town helping us, that we would have to inform our community members. When it first started, people in town in Durham thought, oh, great, refinery on Durham Point, the Durham Pointers can have it, and we'll just benefit from the taxes or whatever, a few lower taxes. But when we did the research, we realized that this was the world's largest oil refinery. The numbers were staggering of how much oil would be produced, how it would be refined, how many pollutants would go up into the air, how much chronic spillage there would be when they're transshipping the oil out at the Azza Shoals, how much downstream industry would glom onto the project, how many rail cars, 200 rail cars a day taking products out of here, trucks taking stuff. It was just unbelievable, and it really we had to work so hard to bring this information to our community, and then to the greater Seacoast community, and then to the state. So organizationally, we had just an incredible task, because we also realized that that we needed to fight the battle on 3 levels: on the local level, at a vote at town meeting; at the state level, if the state decided to override Durham; and then we might, if the state passed it, then we'd have to go to the federal level where there would be hearings. So we had to hire lawyers. We had to understand the legal ramifications at each level. But the most important advice that we received was from the Seacoast Anti-Pollution League and the Clamshell Alliance. They were the people who were fighting the Seabrook nuclear power plant, and that plant had been voted by the town of Seabrook. The proponents came in, made all kinds of promises, said this is going to be great for your town, and they said, yep, we want it, we believe you. And then the surrounding communities in the Seacoast, later recognizing the impacts of such a huge project, they rose up to oppose it. But it was a much more difficult fight, and not a fight that they won. So they said, if put everything you've got into it at the local level, and try and get oppose it there, and that would be the best thing. So that was our strategy to do that. So that was the effort where we had to figure out how to get a question onto our town meeting ballot that demanded, or that people would respond to by saying no. So the question was, do you want to change your zoning ordinance to allow an oil refiner? No. So, but it took us a while to figure out just what that question should be on the ballot. Dudley will tell you exciting stories about her role in the whole issue of home rule and battles in the New Hampshire legislature and with the governor. She has great stories to tell. But I can't tell you how frightening it was for me at age 27, having no experience, just being a housewife, farmer's boy, mom, to be thrust into this environment where I had to drop any sense of self-consciousness, which was hard because I was pretty self-conscious, realizing that I was just sort of the figurehead of this organization, and that there were so many people in my community, many of whom I didn't know until we fought this battle, who were depending on me to be their spokesman. And I did my best, but it was very scary to have Channel 4 in Boston call you and say, we'll be up with cameras at 8:30 a.m. And oh my God, what am I going to do with my poor daughter at nursery school? I call my mom, she drives an hour to come up. And then later on, my daughter saved my life. I can't tell you how many times by switching the laundry or making me a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. She was wonderful, and she really they're wonderful, funny stories, and one I'll tell you, and I'll end on it, and we can maybe talk more informally later. But we hadn't seen our close friends since we moved to Durham Point, Sally and Dan Ford, for a month or more, because everything was happening so fast. And so we said, well, come over, we'll have some coffee, and the kids can play together. They had an only daughter, and we had an only daughter. So the kids went off into the playroom, and we were sitting there having our coffee and talking about strategies and how things were going. And all of a sudden the kids came running in and said, look, come in, come see what we've done. And we walk into the playroom, and they have taken the old wooden blocks and things and built a refinery on the floor. It was like 2 or 3 feet tall, and they said, okay, now watch. And they threw something at it, and it all came clattering down. And they were just jumping for joy.
If my phone goes off in my pocketbook, I'm sorry. It's not like seagulls. But it's a new phone,
So-
and I can't get it to mute.
So anyway, so here we go. So as you can see, the next hero that we want to talk about is none other than former Representative Dudley.
It's so nice to see you all here. I have to say, you probably have all heard this story more than once, and it's amazing that you've come again. But it does have legs, as they say. And David has done a wonderful job with this book. I hope you'll all read it if you haven't. It's a terrific book. I do have to correct him on one thing, and that is that he's not the only person who has written about this. Elise Daniel from Durham wrote a really wonderful paper, and Lisa Mole wrote a book about what was going on in Rye at the time, about the refinery. I also want to be sure that we emphasize the role that Phyllis Bennett played. Phyllis was my very best friend and died almost 3 years ago now. But she and her husband did come, as Nancy mentioned, from Baltimore, where they had both been on the Baltimore Sun. And they started their dream, their country newspaper. And if we hadn't had that, I don't know what would have happened. It could have been very, very different, because they made it possible for everyone in town who had an interest to be informed. No other paper did that. It wasn't not the Globe, not Foster's, not the Portsmouth Herald, not the New Hampshire Times. Eventually they all got into it, but it was that early warning that meant a great deal to us, and Phyllis and her husband Steve Bennett and their editor Dick Levine were responsible for that. I was a state rep at the time. I also was younger. And I think I was 37. And I was a freshman state rep. I think I'll tell you how I got to be a state rep. At that point in my life, I thought there would be nothing more exciting, no greater goal, than to be a participant in the New Hampshire Democratic Convention. And so I learned how you got to be a participant, a member of the convention. Well, you had to be a candidate for something. So I filed to be a candidate for state rep. Now, no woman had ever been elected from Durham. No Democrat had ever been elected from Durham since 1918, when Katie Payne's grandfather was elected as a Democrat. It never occurred to me, quite honestly, that I might win. Well, somehow I did. But that gives you some idea of how naive I was and how unprepared I was, really, for what lay ahead. When we got the first notion that there was an oil refinery being considered for Durham Point, it didn't honestly, I couldn't honestly believe it. It did not make any sense at all. Why Durham Point? Then I thought, well, I bet the people in the Virgin Islands, when they heard there was going to be an oil refinery in the Virgin Islands, they thought, not here. Why would there be an oil refinery here? So I began to take it a little more seriously, particularly when a friend who was a legislator and very savvy called to say she would help in any way that she could. And I thought, oh, I guess I really better pay attention. Then I realized that the selectmen, as Nancy mentioned, were taking quite a different approach. They were considering, they were weighing, they were wondering, they were looking at all points of view, enough so it could drive you crazy if you thought that they were taking a point of view that you wouldn't agree with in the end. They were offered all sorts of things. They were offered to be flown to England to look at refineries. They were offered to be flown to Canada to look at refineries, or to California. And to their credit, they never accepted any of those. I began to wonder how I could have an impact on this enormous gargantuan project for my town. And I remembered that very early on, after I had been elected, maybe even, just after I had been elected, I was sitting at my kitchen table with a friend, Marty Gross, who was a lawyer in Concord. And he said, if you ever want to get anything through the New Hampshire legislature, here are 2 words you have to use: home rule. Okay, so I started to think about that. Maybe this was a time for home rule. And I went to Legislative Services and I asked them if they could draft a bill that would say no refinery can be built in any community in New Hampshire unless the community approves of its siting first. And they did that. And then followed a series of meetings that Nancy didn't mention, but which she played an enormous role in. There were other gatherings besides the one that she has mentioned. One at the field house, which was just absolutely jammed. It was the time that the Onassis people said they were going to be there to answer all of our questions. And so there they were. I think there were 9 of them, arrayed in captain's chairs across the front of the stage, all there in their suits. It was February. And we then, one by one, got up to ask them questions. And Celeste Mambro, I hope many of you remember her, asked a question about how we could believe them since, and then she gave examples of times when they had been found not to be telling the truth about spills and disasters at other refineries. Then Cliff Horrigan got up to speak, and there was Cliff in her LL Bean jacket and her LL Bean boots, and she was a graduate student at the time, and she wanted to know where they were going to get the requisite 6,000 gallons of fresh water a minute. That's what they said they needed for cooling of the refinery. And they said, oh, 6,000 gallons of fresh water a minute. Well, just a minute. And Mr. Green, who was leading the discussion, turned to the men in their captain's chairs behind him and buzzed with them for a few minutes, came back to the microphone and said, we've made a mistake. We only need 3,000 gallons of fresh water a minute. And Cliff, to her everlasting credit, was not deterred. And she said, and where are you going to get 3,000 gallons of fresh water a minute? He turned to the men behind him again, returned to the microphone and said, now we only need 1,500. And that is a true story. And why would we ever believe anything they said? So it was, as Nancy has described it pretty accurately, it was a very stressful time. It was an exciting time. And I'll tell you one story. I got a phone call one night, and I don't remember from whom it came, and I wouldn't tell you. But the phone call said, Dudley, I just saw a legislator's car, a black legislator's car, filled with Greeks, going down Durham Point Road. And I thought, who could that be? So then I thought maybe I knew who it might be, a legislator who had some interest in Durham and who was supportive of the refinery. And so I got in my car. I drove very quickly down Durham Point Road until I came to Sally Ford's driveway. I drove up her driveway and I drove into a tree. And then I got out of the car and I could still move it, so I moved it further and I came in. And then I decided I should come home. I was a nervous wreck. Anyway, I came home, I told Tom what had happened, and he said, well, what are you going to do? I said, I think I'm going to call his house, the legislator. So I called his house and I got his wife, and I said, I'd like to speak to Tony's very important guest, because I didn't know. Was it Gratzus? Was it Onassis himself? It was his very important guest. She didn't say, I don't know who you're talking about. She said, they are at a remote location. Come on. So then Anyway, the night went on and on and on, and finally, Tony called me back, and he said, "What are you doing? What do you want?" And I said, "I want to speak to your important guest." And he said, "Well, I'm sorry, he's busy. You can't talk to him right now." And at that very moment, I heard Janie, his wife, say to their very important guest, "Ari, I want you to look at these before they go in the oven." Now, someone who knows the family well said that isn't true because Janie never put anything in the oven. But that's how I remember it. And to this day, I don't really know who that was. But one thing that Nancy did that she didn't mention was she asked people to sign petitions in opposition to let the governor know how they felt about the oil refinery. And so they did, and there were more than 4,000 people who signed the petitions. Nancy very cleverly scotch taped them together so that they could have a little parade downtown, and they stretched from one end of town to the other of the downtown. It was significant, and pictures were taken of that. It was a great, great event. And actually, only today, I had a phone call from a woman in Rhode Island who was organizing on a slightly related subject, but not the same. And she is doing petitions, and she is knocking herself out because she didn't do the stringing them down the main street. She's just read Small Town, Big Oil. So, the legislature, first of all, why was Durham chosen as the site? There are several different theories, but I think it may be as simple as Onassis being at a cocktail party in New York City and coming upon a couple of people from Onassis's office, perhaps, who suggested they wanted to do an oil refinery someplace, and Thompson saying, "Oh, well, come to New Hampshire. We'd love to have an oil refinery in New Hampshire." And remember, this is the same governor who wanted Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard to secede, and the promise that he made to them if they would secede would be that he would make sure that they got a nuclear power plant. So he wasn't really in tune with the feelings of the people. That would hardly have enchanted Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket. Anyway, as the plans developed, it became clear that it wasn't only going to be a problem for Durham, it was also going to be a huge problem for Rye and the land between Durham and Rye, and it was going to be a massive problem for the Isles of Shoals, where there would be 2 piers built. One was going to be 300 feet long, 300 yards long, 900 feet, 3 football fields, which would accommodate 200 tankers a month. And there was going to be one that was even larger than that, which would accommodate 90 very large crude carriers, bigger. Then the oil would be discharged from those into some sort of floating ball where it would be stored briefly until it could be offloaded into smaller ships or into a pipe which would go across the ocean to Rye, where it would come up on land and then overland across Rye and Newington and Durham. And the destruction to this seacoast, not just Durham, but to the shoals, to Rye, to Newington, to some parts of Portsmouth, was almost impossible to contemplate. Anyway, the day came for the vote in the Durham town meeting. It was our annual, we had a town meeting at the time, and I like the town meeting form of government, I have to say. Anyway, all the townspeople gathered, and Joe Michael was the moderator, and he was he was a wonderful moderator. He saw that everybody kept order, no one was rude, and there were a lot of feelings in that room. And the vote came, and the vote was 9-1 in opposition to the oil refinery. It was a very happy day. Nancy spoke. Nancy got a standing ovation. It was a wonderful, wonderful day. There were a few people who spoke in favor of the oil refinery, but not many, and they were very brave. But the serendipitous part of it all is that the very next day, my bill was going to be heard in the legislature, and that is absolutely luck. You can't orchestrate that kind of thing. But it turned out that way, and when my vote was on home rule, when it was voted on, it passed. It was a voice vote, so we never will know what the margin was, but it was very clear that it passed with a substantial margin. The balconies were filled. There was press there from as far away as Australia. The New York Times was there. John Kiffner. It was a really marvelous feeling. But it was in large part due to what happened in Durham the night before, because those legislators from Berlin and from Nashua and Manchester and North Conway, who really wouldn't have felt the impact of an oil refinery the way we did, knew that if something was so opposed in their town, they wouldn't have wanted it. They would have wanted home rule for their town, and so they voted against the oil refinery and for home rule. And that night, a group of us went out to dinner. Nancy was there, and probably 10 people who had worked very, very hard. We went to a restaurant, and across the room I could see this table of Texas Instruments and Pervin and Gertz and Mr. Green and all the people who had been advising Onassis, and they got up, and I thought, oh my God, they're going to come over and tell us they're going to do it in Rochester. It would have been just as bad. They came to our table and they put out their hands and they said, "We want you to know the right side won." And it was the most incredible feeling. It felt very good, but it was because of a lot of work. Thank you.
You know, it's so great when you have to make a presentation and have somebody else do it for you. To have the real heroes here. Just a couple of comments about what Dudley said. It's true that Nancy got a standing ovation, but it's also true that Dudley got a standing ovation as well, as you can imagine. And the town was, really excited. And I will say one thing about the Board of Selectmen. There were 5 members of the board. They were all male, of course. And there was one member of the Board of Selectmen who came out immediately in opposition, and that was Larry O'Connell. I mention that for anybody who knows Larry. He's still around. I was in the political science department at the time. He was in political science. I didn't realize he had been on the town council. I hadn't realized what role he played. But he was he was the only selectman who came out. And all the other selectmen did that horrible, horrible thing, waiting to look at both sides and evaluate all the possible arguments. Whereas Dudley and Nancy and a lot of other people knew right from the beginning, this will not work. So anyway, the third person who was involved in this was Phyllis Bennett. Phyllis died in 2015 after I had interviewed her for a long time about it, and she had gotten pneumonia. She was a real dynamo, and despite having pneumonia, she kept up her daily activities and worked, and she was driving back from Manchester, and after leaving her grandson off, and she just drove off to the side of the road and passed. Fortunately, I did talk with her. I did talk with her family, talked with Meredith and Patrick, her twins, her children, and I talked with Ray Bellis, who was her husband, and they all strongly supported my going forward with the story. And so there are some things I want to talk to you about, and then I'm going to read a couple of excerpts from the book about her. This was a cartoon by Bob Nilsson that was put in the public occurrences, and it says right here, Seacoast Communities right here, the Olympic gift, and you can see Onassis, and you can see Peter Boros, and you can see Melvin Thompson. The other people are just filled in, and I'm not sure if this is who this is, but it's, in any case, it says, "But little lady, we only wish to build a nature park, or retirement home, or game preserve." These were the various.
This Evelyn Brown with the glasses in the front there.
Evelyn Brown.
Yeah, Evelyn
Okay,
Brown.
okay, Evelyn Brown.
And he was.
I have a picture of
referring to
Evelyn
her.
Brown here. I'll show you too. She was. Here's a photo of the first meeting that Nancy and SOS were able to film. They had 700 people meet there, and you can see who's standing there in the middle, and other people who you may or may not recognize depending on how long you've lived here. This was what Dudley refers to. These are petitions. They were held all along the street from one end of the story, which would be now about where it went all the way to the corner.
Yeah, it went from the post office to town and campus.
Town and campus, yeah, town and campus all the way up to the post office. It's a lot of petitions. What Dudley didn't talk to you about was when she went and visited the governor to give him the petitions. And this is the aftermath of that picture. And under there, it doesn't show it there, but it does say at the bottom underneath, because it was a photo in the Concord, you can see it, badly treated. Do you want to go ahead and tell the story, or?
That's here. Use this.
Does that work? Not yet. No. Down. Does that work?
Yeah.
It does? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, no. Well, I took the petitions. I took the petitions to the governor, but I had made 3 appointments to see him, to give him the petitions.
This one should work.
And he kept canceling the appointments. The 3rd time he canceled the appointment, it was because he was going to be in New York to get oil for snowmobiles. When we were all desperate for oil for our cars or for our homes. Anyway, but the 4th time it was kept. And so I went to Concord. I went into the governor's council chambers, and I sat there. And I waited, and I waited, and I waited. And in the council chambers also, which is just outside the governor's office, there was a gaggle of press people. And they were there to take a picture of me giving him the petitions. But the governor didn't come out, and he didn't come out. And I said, hey, want to take a picture of me under this portrait? You can't see it, but there's a portrait there of my great-great-great-grandfather, who was the first president of New England, just so you know. And I thought it would be very funny. So there I am, totally crazed, and at just that moment, the governor's secretary came out and said, the governor will see you now. And so that sort of got me into this frame of mind. That's what you see there, crazy woman.
Well, what she also didn't mention is that she didn't stay in there more than 5 minutes, right? What, you were a little disrespectful?
Oh. I pointed out to the governor that the shortage wasn't of refined oil that we were experiencing, it was of crude oil to refine. So really, a refinery without crude oil wouldn't help. But anyway, at which point he said, get off your high horse and get out of here. So I did.
So that leads to the so she was interviewed, and she complained that she was badly treated. And then the governor came, had to have a response saying that she had been disrespectful or something. But in any case, she got the better of it. She got her picture in the paper and badly treated. Chris Spiro was a key to helping organize the state legislature, to organize the legislature, and in the book we cover how Dudley worked with Chris to organize and to rally the troops in the state legislature. Because first of all, there was a Republican majority. Secondly, most Republicans and even some Democrats were less concerned about the environment than they were about the economic conditions that I talked about earlier. This is the public occurrences issue, and this is where it played such an important role. This was in, here you can see, is October 5th, 1973. And all it says was, an oil refinery on Durham Point, an attempted land grab causes a week of rumors. The interesting thing about it was there wasn't any more information in the paper than what Nancy already had, but it was in the paper. And suddenly, in a printed format, that got Dudley concerned and people across the state concerned, and suddenly they said, if it's in the paper, it must be true. And in those days, that was probably true. These days, you never know. Fake news all the time, right? So I've heard, right? I don't know. So this was another issue of public occurrences, and that's one of the keys I wanted to say about what Phyllis and Steve did. Phyllis and Steve Bennett were married. They founded this paper together, and then at a certain point, at a certain point, Steve decided that he had other interests, and he left Phyllis, he left his kids, and he went away with a woman who had been hired by them to work at the paper. And so then Phyllis became the editor. And so by December, she's still the editor and running all of the stories that she could possibly find. Every time Nancy had a new report, an economic report or any other kind of report about what the professors at UNH were finding out about these promises, she would publish the full thing in the paper. And as you can see in this case, the oil refinery, 19 articles and reports. You can see how thoroughly the public occurrences was done. This was Evelyn Brown. Evelyn Brown was the person, one of the other stories in there, who had been approached early on to buy one of her properties. She had two properties, and one was salty, and she was willing to sell that. It was a smaller piece of property, but she didn't know what it was for. It was for game preserve, because we want to have some vacation home. But she wouldn't sell the other property. In the meantime, Peter Boris, there was actually Papademos, apparently went to her house when she wasn't there and looked around. And he talked to her on the phone and he said, little lady, we'll buy those planks, those boards, right out from under you. That's where this little lady comment comes from. And so she was outraged. First of all, she was outraged that people had been around looking at her house when she wasn't there. You'd know it's from the outside. But mostly she was outraged that she had sold options on a piece of property under false pretexts. And she sued, or went to court, went to her lawyer anyway, to try to get it revoked. This was a picture of the governor. That is not Loeb in the background. This is obviously Onassis and the governor when they met, when when Harry, you write about him often enough, you think you're friends with him. When Aristotle Onassis came to visit in the state, it was an incredible experience about what happened when he came and flew over in a helicopter. When he flew over in a helicopter, there were people who went out and had signs in the snow. This sign says, although you may not be able to tell it, "Not here." Other signs said, "Ari, go home." So there was a great deal of resistance, as you can imagine, to that. Dudley mentioned the Olympic presentation. This, of course, was also covered. The Olympic presentation occurred at the end of February. This was reported on March 1st at their presentation. These were all the men. This is Bob Green, I think, isn't it? Up here on the left. And he was the one who went back and consulted with this group and discovered in a matter of 30 seconds he could reduce the requirement for water by 75%. Very, very good. That's Celeste Mambro on the left, and she was the one who said, "Are you going to," she asked them directly, "are you going to honor the commitment you had made earlier that you would not put a refinery in a town that doesn't want it? And if you're not going to, how can we believe anything you're going to say?" Well, that's what she said at the first meeting. Then there was a second meeting on Sunday, and she just got up there and essentially told them that, I don't know, I got it in the book, I forgot, but some other comment essentially said, "Go home, we don't want you around." In any case, those were really very exciting times, and the key role that the newspaper played was providing this information, because there was no social media, as you know, and because there were long, extensive reports that had to be dealt with. So the newspaper was the key to that. Right at the end, right before the week of the vote, which was the week of the town meeting. The town meeting was it's scheduled for Tuesday, but they did all town business on Tuesday. On Wednesday, there was the town vote only on the oil refinery, and on Thursday was the vote in the legislature. So starting on Monday, in all the newspapers around the state, Aristotle Onassis men put in a insert, which was unsigned, which, by the way, was contrary to the law of the state of New Hampshire, but nevertheless, everybody knew where it came from, and it was "Help bring a refinery to New Hampshire." And it was a 8-page insert, and they told them to call all your reps and tell them that you want the oil refinery. The reason they believed it would work is that a Boston Globe poll had shown that 65% of the residents of New Hampshire supported an oil refinery. The problem is, as a pollster, former pollster, I can say this, the problem with many polls is that they don't get the question right. And so you can ask a question, do you support the refinery? But that wasn't the issue. Would you support a refinery in your town if your town didn't want it? That was the question. So in any case, as a consequence of the poll, Meldrum Thompson wanted all of the towns to vote on the oil refinery. And they came back, very few towns voted, but when they did, they all said, if it's going to be an oil refinery, it's got to be if the town accepts it first. So that, and mostly combined with what Dudley said about the vote in the town, 1,200 times no, a 9-to-1 ratio was key. And this is a picture of the state legislature voting on what was going on. You can see up in the balcony, everybody waiting to see what's going to happen. And there were several votes. The original vote was on an amendment to a bill that would have put the oil refinery in the Energy Siting Committee. But there was an amendment to that bill that said that not only would the question of the refinery be put in that committee, but the committee would have the authority to override any local objections. So that vote, which would have undone Dudley's hometown vote, was one of the key votes. And I'll let you read it in the story. It's a fantastic event that happened. I think the story is great, and I don't mean that the book is great. I mean that the story is great, and I was very fortunate to be able to write about it. And then at the end, this is the 40th anniversary when there was this block of
Granite.
granite.
60 million years old. New Hampshire granite.
60
Million years
old. Granite, New Hampshire granite. It's granite. Anyway. March 74, Durham says no to Olympic refinery, and a picture of the three people. So I want to talk to you just a little bit more about Phyllis. When Phyllis arrived, when she and her husband arrived, they had been working at the Baltimore Sun, but once they started going out with each other, then of course she had to leave because it was never, according to the rules of the Baltimore Sun, you couldn't have a romantic relationship going on between two employees. So naturally it was the woman who had to leave. And so Phyllis, of course, had to go out and live in the suburbs for a while. But she got a job. She got a job with the Speaker of the House, and there are a lot of wonderful stories about her experience with that. In any case, eventually they invested in the Carroll County newspaper. They made a bundle of money, and they decided to leave Maryland and to come up and to found a paper. And they wanted it in New England because they knew New England had a long history of home rule and of local community, and so they did. So I'll read to you one excerpt, and then it was on Thursday, November 29th. And this is the moment when Phyllis. On Thursday, November 29th, the mood in the Public Occurrences office was surprisingly subdued when Phyllis Bennett returned to help finishing producing the paper for the next day's publication. Governor Thompson had finally made his official announcement about a proposed oil refinery at Durham Point, which, to the consternation of the governor, the paper had revealed to its readers more than 6 weeks earlier. Earlier in the day, she had left the noisy office where her husband Steve and the managing editor Dick Levine were arguing vociferously over some goddamn trivial point about the layout. It was a weekly ritual that was driving her and everyone else in the office crazy. She didn't want to think about how many times Dick had quit in a rage only to be persuaded by her to resume his duties, or how many times Steve had walked out seething with anger. It was a relief for Phyllis to go pick up Patrick and Meredith from first grade, take them home, spend some time with them before dinner, get them fed, bathed, into bed, and then, once the babysitter arrived, return to the office to finish the night's work. The unexpected calm, she realized, was a result of Steve's absence. There was, of course, the usual hum of activity, the reporters typing in the last-minute changes to their stories and talking in normal tones, while Dick worked with Shauna McDuffie as she inputted other stories into the graphic machine. But no yelling or screaming, no Steve. That was odd. Typically, he and she would both stay until Dick and Shauna had finished getting the paper ready for printing, and then Phyllis would drive down to Plastow to the printer while Steve went home to the kids. Dick came over to her. She tilted her head towards Steve's office. Dick shrugged. He didn't know where Steve was. Phyllis wondered if her husband had stormed out of the office once again. When she got home, she wondered, would he be in a terrible mood? But she didn't want to get into that now. There was a lot of last-minute work that had to be done. So she did her work. It was close to midnight when the galleys were finally ready for Phyllis to take down to the printer in Plastow. That was good. She could avoid getting another parking ticket from Patrolman Lester Heath. The Newmarket cop, who would wait near the cars of Public Occurrences staff and immediately At the stroke of one, write tickets for everyone still inside. The ban on parking from 1 o'clock until 6 a.m., November through March, was to clear the street for snowplows when it was snowing. But rather than add that qualification, the law simply specified the hours and the months of the ban. Same, right? Still same nothing. And Lester, for some perverse reason, seemed delighted to enforce the letter of the law. Given his first name, the staff couldn't resist adding an epithet. But tonight, unbelievably, they had finished putting the news to bed early, and Lester, the arrester, looking to write his parking tickets, would be sadly disappointed. When she got home and walked to the door, Steve was standing in the living room with a suitcase. She looked at him, then the suitcase, then back to him. "I'm moving in with Shauna," he said. At first, she didn't grasp what he was saying. Moving in with Shauna? The college student? Why? Did she even know about this? "I'm in love with her." Phyllis dropped into a chair. She couldn't speak. She had no idea anything had been going on between the two of them. God, how long had Shauna even been working for them? It seemed like they had just hired her. Didn't know it must have been last month, or maybe 2 months ago. She couldn't begin to imagine how they had found time together. Her own life was a blur. Taking care of the kids before they left for school and after school was over, and in between those times driving into the Newmarket office, and if not there, then to the many businesses in the Seacoast area that were willing to advertise in their paper, never knowing exactly where Steve was at any given time, but always trusting that he was doing what needed to be done to keep the joint venture going, trusting that she really need to think that he still loved her. "And I'm leaving the paper," he said. "We should sell it if we can, or just fold it up. We've lost half our investment and we'll run out of the other half in a couple of months." Running out of money? He had never said anything about running out of money before. How could that be? They had started with $1 million in nest egg. They had saved it together with their investment in the Maryland paper. And now, 3 months later, it was almost gone. She was barely able to murmur. Where did it all go? Things were more expensive than I expected. The office, the salaries, typewriters, compugraphic machine. It all adds up. We could sell some of it, get some of the money back. She couldn't believe he was giving up everything he had said he ever wanted, giving up his dream of running into his own newspaper, of being a voice for the people, giving up his children, giving up her. "Well, I'm not quitting," she said, her voice more firm now. "If you want to give up everything up for her, for Shauna, go ahead. But I'm no quitter." He shrugged. "Fine. I don't care what you do. Keep the whole thing, run it to the ground. I don't want any part of it." He picked up his suitcase and walked to the door. "I'll come back later to pick up the rest of my stuff." Phyllis didn't move from the chair. She sat there for a very long time, unable to make sense of what had just happened. Her mind a blur of memories and feelings and colors. Her only concrete thought, who's going to run the copygraphic machine? So that was kind of a really hard time for her. And then there's one other kind of shorter thing, which is a little lighter. The Friday morning, is this okay still? Everybody still with me, or we want to stop? Okay. The Friday morning after Steve left with the suitcase in hand, Phyllis had no choice, but as she would later describe it, to keep moving, keep breathing. She had cried most of the night, and then morning, exhausted by lack of sleep and self-recrimination for having driven him out. She had somehow managed to get Meredith and Patrick off to school, delaying explaining anything to the twins when they asked where Daddy was. She then drove down to Plastow to pick up the batch of 5,000 newspapers, drove back up to the post office in Newmarket, where she left half the batch for mailing to subscribers, took the other half batch to the old mill building, where the staff divided the papers among themselves and set out to deliver their portion number to some 35 different locations, all up and down the seacoast. And finally, after completing her assignment, arrived back at home in the early afternoon and collapsed on the living room sofa. After a while, she called her parents. Her mother answered, which was good, because she was always so supportive. And she was this time too, not berating Phyllis for having married such a loser in the first place. Though that is exactly what her mother had said about Steve before they got married. Her mother promised to fly up to New Jersey to help in any way she could, and assuring Phyllis that she would go pack right now and take a flight out the next day. Her father got on the phone, which Phyllis half dreaded, because she knew he had really never liked Steve, and she did not want to hear any "I told you so" comments. While her mother had come to accept her daughter's decision, her father never had. "You are 24 and you have never done anything as terrible as you are doing now," he berated her right before the wedding. And he had never wavered in his opinion, not even when they had the twins, nor when they had started their own newspaper. "You just can't trust him," was his common refrain. When her father got on the phone, he was surprisingly sympathetic, telling her how bad he felt that Steve had left, and how much he would like to help. Phyllis wondered if her mother had warned him to be nice before he got on the phone. That wouldn't be like her. He asked Phyllis about the paper, and she told him what Steve had told her, that half her investment had already been spent, and that the paper was hemorrhaging money, though she had yet to look at the books to see what the exact numbers were. All she knew was that she had to pay a substantial sum each week to get the papers printed, another couple of $100 for postage to mail them to subscribers. She knew that the salaries they paid their staff compared favorably with other local newspapers. She and Steve had agreed that they would never shortchange the people who worked for them. But she had a lot more to learn. "Well, I want you to know," he said, "I'll help you and the children, whatever you need, but I will not," and here his voice got louder, "give you a penny for that newspaper. It would just be good money after bad. I told you it was a terrible idea, a crazy idea. You should have kept working for a good newspaper. You're a great writer, but going into business with Steve, I told you just couldn't trust him, and I guess I was right." Phyllis hardly knew how to react. She was mortified he had interpreted her telling him about her financial difficulties as asking for money. And this is what she said: "I would never, never, ever, ever ask him for a dime. I would have died on the street corner with my kids holding cup in their hands before asking him for anything." It's a very emotional interview. And she said, "Yes, you told me you couldn't trust him, but you never gave any substantial reason why. All you ever said was, 'He's skinny and he's from Oklahoma.' That wasn't exactly anything I could hang my hat on." And he said, "Well, everyone knows you can't trust anyone from Oklahoma." But I wouldn't want you to think that Phyllis was a victim, and they considered herself a victim. She considered herself a strong woman who went on to publish and to eventually win a nomination for a Pulitzer Prize. Bob Nilsson, the cartoonist, also did. And the paper continued to exist for 2 years. When financial difficulties in papers, she was eventually forced to give it up. And eventually, she worked at UNH for 20 plus quarter of a century. But she was a strong person, and I think what you can say about the public occurrences, as Nancy and Dudley will both say, it played such a key role in this operation that you have to recognize the role that Phyllis Bennett made in continuing the paper and providing such an important contribution to the resistance at the time. So that's kind of the story. There are a lot other angles and stories and anecdotes and things in the book if you want one. Let me just say, we can have some questions, but I want to say something real quickly. I have some books for sale. I don't know if I have enough, or maybe I have too many. But if there are some books, if there are some of you who want a book and you can't get one, I have to charge $15 because even though you can get it from Amazon for $13, by the time it gets to me, shipped and everything, it really, I have to cut $15 to cover it. If you want to get it cheaper at Amazon, you can get it for $13.12. But if you do want a book and it turns out that there aren't any left, I will put your name down with your address, and I will, when I get the books, I will get Nancy and Dudley to sign them, and I will sign them if you want it, and I'll bring them, personally deliver them to your house. I'm assuming some of you are not from you know, Florida or out of state. Okay, so if you have questions that you want to ask Nancy or Dudley or me, feel free to do so.
Did the people get their land back?
Yes, there were only options. These were options on the land, and so they paid the money for the option. I think they kept that money for the options.
Yes.
But it was, you know, they might pay $1,000 or $2,000 for the option, but then the people had to sign off that they would agree to sell it for such and such a price when the time came, and the time didn't come. Yeah. Yes.
What was the Senate vote, and did Governor Thompson think about vetoing the bill?
Okay, that's really interesting because it's one of those things that really gets lost into it. And then what I discovered by continuing and looking in the newspaper after the vote was that the week later, is it David Nixon? Senator? Yes, Senator David Nixon was holding hearings in the Seacoast, which Dudley attended, about the bill that had been transferred, that had been sent over from the House to the Senate. The bill that had been sent over had been watered down because when it went through the House, Attorney General Warren Rudman ruled that most of the towns were already covered. It was only the unincorporated places that weren't covered. That was his interpretation. But the interpretation of the court could very well have been different. And so, but that was the watered down bill that essentially said that no town location could be forced to accept a refinery. But when the hearing was held by the Senate, then Dudley proposed to David Nixon that it be amended to include her full wording so that it would cover towns and cities regardless of whether they were incorporated or unincorporated, to make it absolutely clear, which he accepted. And the final bill that, if you look up, the final bill that was passed, it was Dudley's original wording that protected cities and towns and everything else. But by the time it got to the governor signed it. There was no reason not to. It had been passed overwhelmingly. It was a home rule issue. And, you know, up until the oil refinery, he had been an advocate of home rule, of local communities. That was generally the Republican position. And while Dudley was very honest in her assessment of the advantage of using that tactic, Dudley will also admit that there is a problem with a home rule as a tactic, because while the town of Durham could have refused it, the town of Newmarket could have accepted it. You know, the ideal strategy would have been to go after it because it was bad for the environment, but the environmental argument wasn't going to work. So by keeping it out of Durham and causing the problems that it did, eventually Aristotle Onassis, who died, by the way, almost 1 year to the day after the vote, he gave up on the effort, and no further efforts were made by the Onassis people to put an oil refinery anywhere in the country, much less in New Hampshire. Yeah, Nikki.
With so much profit and so much money involved, did you ever experience any threat? Did you ever feel that there was some threat to your family or to your
Threat
life?
to us personally?
Yeah, I mean, did you have phone calls or anything?
Well, I'll let my husband speak to that, because he told me years later there were some awful letters that came to me that he ripped up and never showed me. But I don't think they were threatening. I never felt personally
You never
threatened.
personally felt threatened?
Dudley.
I don't know, we had a couple phone calls that were not friendly. But also, you mentioned money. Chris Spiro, who was the minority leader in the House at the time, was offered by the Onassis people to, that they would support any political campaign that he ever ran for the rest of his life, if he would go with them. And he was, after all, a son of Greece, and it was, I'm sure, very hard for him, but he did the right thing. It took him 3 days, but he did say no, thank you.
Yeah,
I heard that Newmarket voted for it, is that true?
I'm sorry.
I heard that Newmarket voted for the refinery, is that true?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, Newmarket voted in favor, and Rochester would have supported it. But,
The governor had a tactic, which was he asked all of the moderators of all of the town meetings to put it on their ballot, do you want an oil refinery, yes or no? And some did, they weren't forced to do it, but some did, Newmarket obviously did. And some changed the wording to say, would you want it in your town? I can't remember exactly how it was done, but it allowed for home rule. It was a non-binding vote, so it didn't really matter that Newmarket, it didn't mean that Newmarket was going to get a refinery, but it might have encouraged the Onassis people.
yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
Does the university, does Concord have a complete collection of all these issues of public occurrence?
The public occurrences that I looked into were at the university. They are not digitized, and they're not protected in any way. They're just paper after paper copy. Bob Nielsen is giving a copy, a bound copy of all of the issues, as far as he says, as far as he remembers.
Yes, to the Durham Historic Association. And we probably have, from gifts from other people, probably 3 sets that cover the oil refinery battle, not 3 sets of all the publications of public occurrences. But yes, we cover that. But we, as David says, it would be wonderful if we had the money to digitize it so that we knew it was safe, because it is printed on cheap paper and it turns yellow. It's very fragile and friable, but it is bound.
I did talk to the person over in archives at UNH, and a couple years ago, or when I was looking at it, and he said, I forget his name right now, he said that that was on the list of things that UNH was thinking about doing, but he had so many other things they were trying to digitize, mostly UNH communications. And I asked him how much it would cost to digitize it based upon what they were doing, and he said about $5,000. I don't know, when I talked to my wife Zelda, who was a librarian at the state library, I asked her about digitizing, and she said there was a place that the state library would send, I think it was in Rhode Island or some other place, where the state library would send their material down to be digitized. So I think for a modest amount of money, it could be digitized, but so far, no one has taken the initiative to do it. And so there are only these paper copies that are left. Yeah.
What was the reaction of UNH to this possibility of something right on its borders? Did they ever say anything publicly, or did they?
Well, there's a whole story which I didn't go into in there, because ultimately it turned out that UNH was irrelevant. And it was made irrelevant by the governor. The governor wanted UNH to do a oil refinery study, but they wouldn't, in the state, but they wouldn't say where it would be or how big the oil refinery would be. It was after this oil refinery proposal had come out, and so the governor said, I want them to do a study for the state about an oil refinery in the state. Well, of course, it was absolutely asinine to give that kind of a research project to the university when, number one, it wasn't going to be funded. It had to be done by the university. More importantly, it wasn't clear how you can make an assessment of the impact of a refinery if you don't know how big it is or where it's gonna be. But that's what he wanted it to do. So UNH eventually did come out with a report. But the report, because as you might imagine, was not exactly positive, the report was delayed by the governor so that it would not come out before the vote. And so it was delayed, and then finally sometime in April or May, a UNH report did come out, but it was totally overtaken by events. And of course, they didn't know right then, after the vote, that the Onassis people were going to cease all efforts. They didn't know that. So that's why he kept delaying it, but finally when it became clear that there was going to be no more effort, then that's when the governor said it was okay to have it come out. Yeah.
David, I'd like to just add just a little bit to that. Just to say that Save Our Shores, in our effort to inform the citizens of Durham and the seacoast about the impacts of a refinery, had turned to Karen Mower, who was a highly respected woman in our town. Her husband was a professor at UNH. She knew many professors in many of the departments that we needed to tap, who had the expertise to do the kind of research to get the information about oil refinery impacts. She turned to them, she brought them in to her home and explained how important it was for them to use their expertise to help the community understand what it would mean to us. Because they could reach out across the country, actually around the world, to refineries in Europe, California, Texas, New Jersey, and bring that information back to us about the impacts on health, the impacts on the environment, the effects on the politics of the situation, taxes, all these different things. And she organized our technical committee into a very effective fighting force. And then those articles could go to public occurrences. But before they did, we had a SOS information meeting in December 8th, to inform the Durham community. And many of those professors spoke there, as did the selectmen, to give their position on why they were kind of holding back. But the point I want to get to is the professors that help Save Our Shores inform their community and the greater Seacoast community really put their jobs on the line. They committed themselves to the highest level of, I think, their profession to get the information out, to do it fairly, and the governor tried to silence them. He hated the fact that they were doing this research and it was coming out in public occurrences, and that we, Save Our Shores, was able to comment so articulately about how other communities across the country who had oil refineries as their only industry, how it totally took over their towns and what it did to the social fabric of the towns and to their economies and to their environment and their health. So the efforts of the governor to silence the university by this kind of fake study, it's a study of oil refinery in southeastern New Hampshire, something like that title of that. It kind of just kept a lot of people busy, but it all happened a little too late. We were able to get the information out before they were really silenced and having to focus just on this sort of trumped up study.
It was difficult for the professors because there was some question as to whether or not they could participate, since they were government employees and they belonged to the state. You know, he was very much of kind of like our current president in terms of the power that he thought that he had should be done. So he did not want people in the state to, who were employed by the state, to work against him. But I think it was Richard Feynman, who was the vice president for academic affairs, who said that according to bylaws and everything he understood, that professors on their own could do their own separate work on their own and contribute and make, whatever they want to. It's the whole notion, you can't, kind of a freedom of speech thing. You can't have your professors have a freedom of speech, then you really got a problem. But anyway, that's what one other thing I should mention is that the union leader really, with Thompson, hated the town, hated UNH. And one of the stories that we find out about, and he hated people in UNH, but according to a reporter who wrote for Esquire, wrote this really fantastic article by Esquire, he said there are a lot of people I don't like, but there's one person I really hate, Dudley. I mean, it kind of blows your mind, but if you read the union leader during the time that they went after her, during the whole period when she was in politics, you get an idea of how much he disliked the notion that this upstart young woman was out of her place, just challenging. Absolutely horrible. Yeah.
David, the two people that I remember were Sam Reed, who was the finance professor, whose son now heads the Nation Conservancy, and the other was Jim Horrigan, whose quote you have in the beginning, whose son Tim now represents this district in the legislature. Both of them are apostates anyway in business school, as I recall. But I think they went up against Joe Millivet, according to your book, I think it was, that they had, the importance of that study was, there was a study by the lawyer, one of the lead lawyers in the state, that said the refinery would be good for the state, and that's when Sam produced a report saying it wasn't.
Well, there's a local town attorney, Joseph Melamed, who said that the town would benefit greatly from the tax advantage. And it was Sam Reed, an economist, who looked at it and said, and he went after Melamed, who was very well respected, and he went after Melamed pretty much and said, essentially said, you didn't read the law. They say this to a respected attorney, but that was not too good. But he said, look, if you take a look at all the things that compose an oil refinery, the main part of the oil refinery can't be taxed because it fell under some certain category. The only things you could tax, you couldn't tax the pipeline, you couldn't tax the oil itself because it's interstate commerce. So what can you tax? Well, you might be able to tax a few of the buildings that are around there, but ultimately the amount of money that you would be derived from the additional taxes would be overwhelmed by the additional services that you would have to provide for all the additional people that would be certainly coming in, not to mention the roads and the disruption. So what Sam Reed's study was crucial to debunking the notion that suddenly Durhamites were going to find themselves having a reduced tax rate. There were two other things. One was the argument about the availability of oil and gas, and the other one was all the jobs. Turns out the jobs may be closer to 1,000 jobs, if you're talking about permanent ones. Maybe not that many, because most of the jobs would have to be by experts in the oil refinery business, would have to come from outside of Durham. And then, as it turns out, with respect to the distribution of oil and gas, that's done on a regional basis by the federal government. Even in Elizabethtown, New Jersey, which is surrounded by oil refineries, they have long lines of people waiting for gas. So don't think that Durham is suddenly going to find itself relieved from the problems of shortage of oil.
The other thing that Sam Reed was able to do, and Jim Horrigan too, they really looked into how oil refining companies in every aspect of their business, how they organize themselves so they can shift their profits from one part of the business to another. And it's really quite a shady business, and they were able to draw all that out. It's a huge international market with shifting profits. And so it really made us extremely wary of this coming to Durham.
One more question.
Pursuant to your experience, were you ever enlisted to help others with their grassroots efforts?
Oh, absolutely. I can't tell you how many times Dudley and Phyllis and I would be called upon, but I especially, as chair of Save Our Shores, and I would talk to them about getting on top of things just as fast as they could, not to be shy, but to, you know, get out there and reach out and tap experts in your area. But yes, many groups, a group in Vermont that was fighting some kind of an oil industry up there, the water extraction process in the Northwood area. What is it, something spring? But I think that's quieted down, but yeah, a number of groups. And then, Northern Pass, yeah.
And Nancy and I are having dinner on Friday night with a woman from Rhode Island whose little town wants to adopt a charter, and she's not sure about how to go about that. We're gonna go.
Okay,
And
what-
I was just gonna say one more thing, David, sorry to keep popping up like a, I don't know what. It's been a story that we've told also in many university classes, and it seems to be a story that resonates with really young and old, because it's a story of that local people can make a difference. And you don't have to be an expert to get out there and learn about things and get help from other people. And that's been probably the nicest thing that has happened, is all the wonderful people that we've met along the way.
Thank you very much.